Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Corey Hastings. I'm North Pier Search Consulting's Director of Communication. Again, we appreciate you joining us today for this important topic. We're going to be discussing cybersecurity, what plan sponsors and allocators need to know. Just up top, I'm going to be announcing today's speakers. Freeman Wood is North Pier's Senior Consultant. Gregory Metzger is Senior Consultant and Search Practice Leader at North Pier. And David Hall is the Chief Marketing Officer at Hall Benefits Law. So without further ado, I'd like to pass this off to Senior Consultant Freeman Wood to begin our webinar.
Thanks, Corey. Welcome, everybody. And again, thank you for joining our webinar. The objective of the webinar today is to provide you with valuable information about regulatory trends and best practices regarding cybersecurity in the investment management space. Cybersecurity, cyber risk is a huge area, and it's growing very rapidly. We're not going to cover every topic on this 1-hour webinar, but what we are going to do is provide you with some important considerations to better prepare you and information to better protect your organization, particularly with respect to your advisor, consultant, and OCIO relationships, as well as other service providers. Next slide, Corey, please. So why is cybersecurity management so important? Well, in the investment management space, and particularly with retirement plans and retirement plan asset management, this is really a huge area. And it's because the dollars in these plans are huge, so they're very attractive to cyber criminals, and there is a huge amount of private data information for plan participants, again, that is very attractive to cyber criminals. So it's an area where there's a lot of focus and a lot of potential risk. We divide the risk into 3 broad categories. The first is reputational risk. Whether you are an investment advisor or an asset allocator in the investment world, your reputation, your organization's reputation is really important in maintaining the trust of your clients and your stakeholders. Trust is a critical piece of asset management, and in a cyber event or a weakness in cybersecurity can really have a negative impact on that trust, and that's something obviously we want to avoid. The second piece is regulatory risk, and David Hall in a few minutes is going to take you through what's going on in the regulatory world and how there's increased scrutiny by regulators and potentially very significant costs if issues or weaknesses are identified. And the last piece is financial risk, and this is really the big one. There's a direct cost to your organization for weak cybersecurity measures and risk management. It's estimated that close to $600 billion, or nearly 1% of global GDP, is lost to cybercrime every year. And that's just an enormous number, and it's growing. It could easily eclipse $1 trillion a year. So the financial risks are huge, and it isn't something that's just in the sort of corporate world. It's also in asset management. I think, Greg, you've got an example of that specifically.
Yes, I do. Welcome, everyone. It's good to be here. So last year, a major financial organization was victim to ransomware, and it was around 10 days before they were actually able to access data. While they did have some business continuity practices in place, and there's no evidence that there was any challenges with trading and the investment of the money. It was a significant reputational damage that organization faced.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, it's a big thing, and it's just only getting bigger. And what we'd like to do today is take you through some of the changes in the regulatory environment, changes with the Department of Labor, things to think about, tips to consider, ways to get prepared, and talk about how you deal with your service providers and your investment managers and your consultants as well. I'd like to start by turning it over to David Hall to talk about the regulatory aspects.
Thanks,
And
Freeman.
if you don't mind,
oh, go ahead. I'm
so
sorry.
sorry to interrupt, David. I just wanted to say really quickly that we are going to be using the Q&A function in the webinar, so you'll see that on your Zoom bar that you should see. It says Q&A. So if you have any questions, Feel free to ask those throughout the presentation. I will be bringing those up to our experts. Otherwise, we'll have a dedicated time for Q&A at the end of the webinar where you can similarly ask those questions.
Thanks, Corey.
David. I forgot to mention that up top. So
yeah, actually, I did too.
Chiming in.
Yeah, and we would really appreciate questions. We'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So please don't be shy.
Right.
Absolutely. Again, thanks, Freeman, Corey, Greg. It's really great to collaborate with you guys. And just off the top, I just want to reiterate Corey's comment. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Hall Benefits Law, so I'm not an attorney. But I do hope that you'll ask questions. And if there's a question that I can't answer, I'm happy to take that to our team. And we really enjoy working with plan sponsors and service providers to help you answer any questions you may have. So just off the top, so you know who we are, HBL is a boutique ERISA law firm. We're headquartered here in Atlanta, Georgia, as you can see behind me. We serve plan sponsors and service providers as well in 39 states. So we take a collaborative approach to legal guidance. We serve plan sponsors alongside other great groups like North Pier and Mercer. So it is appropriate that we're collaborating on this webinar, as that's part of our DNA. So thanks to both of those organizations for allowing us to collaborate today. I'm just going to provide a very high-level overview of the agency guidance that we do have relative to cybersecurity. And then I'm going to follow that up with a real-world example of why it is so important for plan sponsors and service providers not to take the guidance lightly. So thank you, Corey. You're right where I need to be. So in April of 2021, we all know what was going on. We were coming towards the end of the pandemic era, as some people would call it. And the DOL issued some guidance specifically related to cybersecurity. Now, why would they do this? Most plan sponsors depend on a third party to maintain compliant benefit plans. Communicating and collaborating with a third party typically involves some form of information that's transmitted by computers or by the internet. Now, the pandemic itself had exacerbated employer vulnerabilities and was presenting its own unique technological challenges. So I think we can all extrapolate from these facts why the timing of this DOL guidance was so apropos. And they issued this triad of informal guidance, and it was broken into three parts. This triad of informal guidance, by the way, you can read more about it in a cybersecurity article that our team wrote that was published in Bloomberg Tax and Compensation Planning Journal. There is a link to that in the presentation, and when you receive a copy of our slides, that will be an active link that you can click and then read in detail a little bit more about what I'll be covering at a high level today. But the guidance was broken into three pieces. Tips for hiring a service provider. I think Freeman is going to go into some of that just from a practical perspective, but you want to be looking for a service provider with strong cybersecurity practices. How do you do that? Cybersecurity program best practices. And then finally, some online security tips that were really, I think, wisely targeted at plan participants. Okay, next slide, please, Corey. So, you know, part of what is the duty of a plan sponsor, according to the DOL, is to make sure you're evaluating the adequacy of all of your service providers at a number of different levels. And so for this particular set of guidance, we're talking about evaluating cybersecurity policies and controls when you choose a vendor. So they've gone into a lot of detail around what you as a plan sponsor should be looking at and looking for when you choose a cybersecurity vendor, or when you choose a vendor of any type. Maybe it's a third-party administrator, maybe it's your RIA, maybe it's your fund manager, right? So we want to always be comparing, according to the DOL, the candidate's cybersecurity policies to an industry standard. So making sure you're aware of that industry standard and holding up that industry standard as a mirror to the candidates that you're looking to hire. We want to make sure we're requesting validation of the adequacy of the policies and controls that are in place. I know Freeman's going to speak a little bit to the different types of reporting. The system and organization controls for service organizations, or SOC, is again technical, so I won't get into that, but Freeman will speak briefly to that as well. You want to understand if there's been a history of security incidents, and if there has, how did that service provider respond? Was it internal? Was it external? Was it their fault? Have they remedied the breach? We want to make sure that just as a plan sponsor, you're required to carry fiduciary breach liability coverage, that your plan sponsor service providers are carrying not only insurance against cybersecurity threats, but the appropriate levels of insurance. And this would need to cover threats both internal and external to the service provider, as well as internal and external to you, the plan sponsor. And then again, we just want to make sure that as the DOL provides guidance, as there is evolving cybersecurity and information security standards, that these service providers are evolving alongside of those standards. And the most important piece, and this is something that we always highlight for our plan sponsor clients, is making sure that you're not just asking the questions, but that you're getting these answers in writing as part of a written service provider agreement, so that if there's ever a question or an issue, you have a remedy in a service agreement. Okay.
David, just a real question. How should non-ERISA plans think about DOL guidance?
Well, you know, non-ERISA plans are still subject to DOL scrutiny. So I think that everyone, whether you're a church plan, you're an ERISA plan, you've got other plans, maybe it's a long-term incentive plan that you've got in place for your executives. The DOL can come in and examine any of these plans at any time. And as you'll see in my case study a little bit later, they don't necessarily have to have a reason to do that. They can just come in, they can put you under audit, and they can look at everything under the sun. So, you know, when we talk about this guidance, it's technically not an ERISA, it's not in the code. So this is informal guidance that currently EBSA, which is the arm of DOL that enforces these regulations, they're coming in and they're making this a part of their boots on the ground, auditors in the office, questions and answers with plan sponsors. So I think this needs to be a blanket approach, not just relative to ERISA plans. Great question. Okay, so let's look at vendors. Okay, we've talked a little bit about plan sponsor duties. Vendors also need to have cybersecurity program best practices. Now, when we talk to third-party administrators or when a health insurance broker hires us, one of the things that we often do is review service provider agreements to make sure that not only are they meeting the regulations that are in the code itself, that are in the law, but they're meeting those best practices that I mentioned earlier. So you want to have, as a service provider, and this is per the DOL, not per David Hall, you want to have documentation of the cybersecurity program in question. You want to have this documented in writing for your clients. You want to be providing security reviews and independent security assessments to your clients and have those available to pull should an agency come knocking. And by the way, the DOL can come to your door just as easily as they can come to the plan sponsor's door. As a matter of fact, a number of plan audits that we've had plan sponsors come to us with actually were initiated with a plan service provider, and then the agency started asking questions of clients who were using that service provider, and that just opens the door and a whole can of worms for the plan sponsor. So just be mindful that you as a plan service provider are not immune to the DOL knocking on your door. And then finally, the DOL is recommending a business resiliency program addressing business continuity, disaster recovery, and incident response. Look, the DOL put out 10 or 11 more high-level pieces of guidance that are targeting specifically vendors. And so again, I would urge you to take a look at that memo, that article that I mentioned earlier, to see more of those details. We're just going to stay at a high level today so that we've got time to get through the presentation and we can hear from Freeman and from Greg. All right, next slide, please. Okay. You know, one of the most interesting pieces of the DOL guidance is that for plan is what they provided for plan participants. And in the same way that I think it was fairly savvy of the DOL to come along almost just at the right time to provide this guidance based on what was going on in the country with the pandemic and the vulnerabilities that plan sponsors and service providers were experiencing, the breaches that we were seeing. It really shows that the DOL is mindful that a lot of the inherent risk, assuming your plans, you as the plan sponsor and you as the service provider are in line with best practices, that inherent risk is going to lie in the hand of the individual participants who are on your platform. And so again, a bit of savvy here from the DOL, and convincing participants that they have skin in the game and giving these online security tips that are really aimed at the individuals participating in these plans can mitigate your risk as a plan sponsor. So it's incumbent upon you, and it's incumbent upon you service providers out there to make sure you're educating the individuals who are either in the plan or using the service. And this is going to help you as well as the plan participant. So again, there were 10 in this case, pieces of guidance from the DOL. I'm just going to highlight 3. And these are 3 things that all of us as individuals should be thinking about. So making sure you have unique and frequently changed passwords for online accounts. There are apps and websites like 1Password, Bitwarden, and probably 100 others. Do your research, but these are going to help your plan participants to have unique passwords and to change those passwords frequently without losing their passwords. And so that's, again, a high-level piece of guidance from the DOL to plan participants. Another one is to avoid public or free Wi-Fi. You never want to be doing your banking on free Wi-Fi. And in the same way, you probably don't want to be accessing employee benefit plan information or secure information, or certainly anything along the lines of personal health information or anything of that nature on a free Wi-Fi network. So reminding plan participants of this, and just saying, look, this is where malware distribution happens. This is where unencrypted connections live. This is where session hijacking occurs. This is where your most vulnerability occurs relative to login credentials. So, telling plan participants about things like Bitdefender, that's our public or free Wi-Fi issue. Third and finally, in terms of the high level top 3 out of the 10 they issued, let's talk about antivirus software on the computers. We're all familiar with antivirus software programs like Norton, Kaspersky, Bitdefender. Well, these are only as good as their latest update. Remember, these programs provide updates to essentially patch over security vulnerabilities. So reminding these individual users and quite frankly, plan sponsors who may be maintaining these machines that you need to be frequently updating your antivirus software is a critical piece of guidance. And again, there are 7 more high-level pieces of guidance that are targeted towards plan participants. Okay, next slide, please. It's not just the DOL, folks. The benefits world is a big one. Sometimes it feels small. And I probably know some of you that are attending the webinar today. We know Freeman, we know of Greg, right? But what we're seeing is that there's a convergence of standards. All of us are subject to certain rules. Our attorneys are subject to the bar rules. Well, for advisors and funds, the DOL isn't regulating advisors and funds. The SEC is. And so in February 2022, the SEC published some proposed cybersecurity rules for RIAs. Why did they do this? It's really to protect the plan participants, and at the end of the day, to protect the money that's in those funds, because cybersecurity incidents at the RIA level can result in things like lapses in communication, inability to place trades, loss of access to accounts, and even investment control, allowing third parties to take control, and outright theft of data or assets. Even prior to 2022, the SEC had been issuing guidance, most recently the Advisors Act compliance rule, which was requiring them to formalize certain policies relative to fiduciary and regulatory obligations. So this is just another layer on top of a lot of existing SEC regulation and guidance. And look, as fiduciaries, RIAs must act in the best interest of their clients in the same way that fiduciaries of a plan must. So the duty of care, the duty of loyalty are in place. And so we're seeing that it's not just the DOL, but there's this convergence of standards across the umbrella of people touching employee benefits. Next slide, please. Those rules on the guidance that was proffered in 2022 are expected to be finalized in the spring of 2023. So as an RIA or as a fund manager or as a fund, there are going to be certain things that are required of you that prior to the guidance becoming formalized or finalized were not. So things like an annual written assessment that will be provided to the SEC. numerous and varied forms that you'll be required to fill out and give to the agency. Required reporting of incidents, cybersecurity incidents to the SEC at a higher level than is currently required. And then finally, there will be strict rules around administration with in-house or third-party resources. Just to highlight again the convergence, of agency rules. It's not just the DOL. So if you're in another industry, you need to be aware of this just as much as if you're in the benefits world. All right. So now's where the rubber hits the road, right? So now we've taken a brief look at the DOL best practices. We've taken a look at convergence of cybersecurity regulation. In just 2 or 3 slides, what does this mean for the plan sponsor? Where are we seeing the impact of the DOL's guidance? Well, HBL frequently engages with clients who may be undergoing an audit. Maybe it's an IRS audit. In this particular case, it was a DOL audit. The plan in question has 155 participants. It's a 401k profit sharing plan, very common size business. And they were selected for a 401k plan audit by the DOL. We don't know why. The reasons were unclear. The items that were requested for the audit were not cybersecurity related, okay? The plan sponsor with our counsel was responsive. We were providing things that are typical item requests of the DOL, things like plan documents, SPDs, a fidelity bond, 3 years of Forms 5500, accountant's reports, IRS determination letters, on and on, right? So this is all just typical run-of-the-mill DOL audit, right? This is happening through EBSA, right? Which is, again, that sub-regulatory agency within the DOL that is tasked with the security of employee benefit plans. So one would expect that after this typical audit was complete, that all the hoops had been jumped through, the DOL would complete its audit. They would offer a letter either offering corrections that need to be performed, any penalties that may be due, etc., and they would close the audit. Well, as you can guess, in this particular matter, this was not the case. Next slide. So look, guys, this plan sponsor was extremely responsive. They hired ERISA counsel. They did everything they were supposed to do. And they were subjected to 8 hours of interviews with the EBSA investigator. And then finally, after all of this, the EBSA investigator said, oh, by the way, let's talk about cybersecurity risk mitigation. They asked our clients upload a litany of materials related to cybersecurity. These were questions that had to do with telework, cessation of access to internal systems upon termination of employee, cybersecurity insurance coverage details, a copy of their company-wide IT policy, on and on. So, as we began to pull the cybersecurity records together, EBSA then sent another email. And this particular email was relative to who are you using for plan service providers? And now answer all these questions about their cybersecurity practices. And so, advocating for the plan sponsor, what we were able to do was shift some of the focus eventually off of the plan sponsor and say to the DOL, look, first of all, this is informal guidance. We're doing the best we can with what we've got. And you're asking us all these questions about our third-party service providers. Why don't you go talk to them? And that's exactly what happened. But, this is somebody that's already, kind of had their life turned upside down and examined under a microscope for months. And then they're subjected to this. So I think the point here is really, in summary, next slide, it's a general warning, right? It's a general warning that plan sponsors should expect EBSA cybersecurity questions and document requests. With the recent publication of cybersecurity guidance, and we expect this will be updated as time goes on, potentially codified, we don't know. The case study, this case study company's experience is becoming the new normal. And as a matter of fact, we just received another referral last week, another company under DOL investigation, they're receiving cybersecurity questionnaires. So now, not later when you're under audit, is the time for you as a plan sponsor and certainly you as a plan service provider, if you have not, to conduct a thorough review of both your 401k plan but also your service provider's cybersecurity risk mitigation policies and practices, so that in the event of a likely future audit, you're not caught with your pants down. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton to Freeman. And Freeman, I'm really excited to hear what you've got to say, because you're going to kind of take this to the next level.
Thanks, David. That's very helpful and very great information. As David mentioned, there's a lot of movement in the regulatory space. The question is, how do you, as an asset owner, an asset manager, how do you protect yourself, and how do you work with organizations that are well protected as well? And what we do in North Pier, one of the things we do is help clients do requests for information or requests for proposals to really assess the various providers, investment managers, advisors, OCIOs, in a wide variety of ways, and cybersecurity is clearly one of them. So we want to spend a little time around what we think an organization should ask to manage this exposure. And it really is divided into two broad categories. First of all, when you're hiring an advisor, a consultant, or an OCIO, what are they doing to manage their cybersecurity risk? And that's clearly some of the points that David covered, and we'll cover some more as we go through this. That's obviously the first level and very important. But also there's that second level, is what are they doing to assess their providers? If they're hiring investment managers on your behalf or for your plan or for your investment program, they have to do their due diligence in as much rigor and strength as they do it internally. And you can see a little bit from the case study that David described, is that the DOL is thinking that same way. It's not just the organization, but it's the organization that they deal with, that they hire, that they use, and their service providers, and how are they doing the due diligence on those service providers to protect themselves as well. Next slide, please. So we wanted to give you some examples of questions that we ask in the RFI or RFP process to really triangulate what exposure there may be and what mitigation is happening. And the challenge is that you're never at the organization, right? This is secondhand or sometimes third-hand information. So asking the right questions and knowing what the right answers should be is really important. Just some examples of questions we like to ask. We like to ask about how an organization is protecting a client's data. Where is that data located? What protections are in place? How is that assessed? We like to look at whether there's a comprehensive cybersecurity program with explicit policies that are laid out very clearly and very extensively. We like to understand internal training and education programs. This is probably one of the most important areas. The example that Greg gave of the organization that was held for ransomware, that was just an employee clicking on a link. They clicked on a hyperlink that they shouldn't have clicked on. Next thing you know, the organization is held hostage. Something as simple as that can be really deadly to an organization. And you're never going to stop those things from occurring, but a good training program, good education, and something that's ongoing and fairly regular can really mitigate that risk. David mentioned independent assessments. We think this is really important, whether it's a SOC 2 report or hiring an independent organization to do cyber risk evaluation, intrusion testing. That external expertise is really important. So understanding whether an organization is doing it in-house or whether they're outsourcing it is important, and where they're getting that expertise. It doesn't matter if you have the best IT person you've ever seen on staff. Cybersecurity is an evolving area. It's a very complex area, and really getting external expertise is important. Next slide, please. So what happens if there's a breach? What type of questions do you want to ask about that? Well, if an organization has experienced a breach, you want to understand how quickly they handled it, what was the effect on clients, stakeholders, how it was communicated, and how it was escalated. And if they haven't had a breach, which is frankly highly unlikely, what are their policies and procedures to correct the problem, to identify the risk and close the gap, to communicate it both internally and externally to clients. David mentioned insurance policies, obviously a critical component of mitigating loss. And then service providers, as we said before, you want to see an organization that is equally committed to understanding risk at service providers, at investment managers, at other people that are touching your data or managing your assets for you. And lastly, we always like to see an organization that does due diligence very comprehensively, and that includes on-site evaluation. That includes assessing cybersecurity. Next slide. So those are some questions we ask. Again, it's not all of them, but it certainly gives you an idea of what we're trying to triangulate. But what are the answers that you're getting? What is a good answer versus what is a bad answer? And this is really, really important to think about. Good answer should be very detailed or thought out. It should be comprehensive and demonstrate the organization is really committed to cybersecurity risk management. And that commitment should be top down. There should be an escalation process to senior management of events that occur, so senior management is in the loop. And that escalation process should also include communicating with clients. As I mentioned before, you want to see an equal amount of robustness and rigor internally as you do externally, and vice versa. And you want dedicated resources, personnel, and use of external providers for testing, for evaluation. Really, you want to make sure that the organization is pulling all of the resources they can to have the most expertise in this area. Greg, I want to ask you for some examples of some answers that we've gotten through the RFP process that you liked.
Yeah. So, yeah, thanks everyone. I'll just say that thorough is very important, and a well thought out and thorough answer is generally very long. So I'm not going to read you the whole answer, but I am going to talk about. I'm going to bring out a couple of areas that are in each answer that's a good answer. Number one, and David and Freeman talked about it, which is having an external report like a SOC 2 there is very important. They should provide it to you. You should be able to review that, but that's not enough because that's something that happens once a year, and you could be having cyber risk during the entire year, and it wouldn't have been mitigated. So things you want to look at, physical security. Does it talk about physical security? Where the employees are, where the data is? Are there locks and alarms on the door? Go that far. Want to talk about the employee access to this data? Is it compartmentalized? Is it compartmentalized? And then you want to talk about all the digital safeguards, but not just the safeguards. A really good program will have hired a third party to do penetration testing, to really go through and test whether or not there's been whether or not there are vulnerabilities. And I think that both of these were mentioned before. There should be a special discussion about the management of access from outside of the firm. And what I mean by that is, I don't know about you, you can't tell from all of our backgrounds, we could be working from home. We're not necessarily logging on. We could be using, someone else in our homes could be using our computers. It's really important that they talk about the training. It's really important that they talk about access. And I'll just add one thing to something that David said about looking at terminating access for employees who are no longer with a firm. If you read through SOC 2s, that is the number one exception that occurs at any firm, is that there are people who moved from a department to another department who shouldn't have access to certain data anymore, or have been or have left the firm who still have access and still have data. And you will see that pretty frequently. And you want to make sure that you know how those things are being addressed.
That's great. Yeah, that's great, Greg. Thank you very much. Some of the stuff that you mentioned, it's some of the things that I've experienced as well in organizations is phishing tests, where you actually external organization will go out and do phishing tests with employees. Obviously, something that is not going to cause a problem to the organization, but it actually is it's a great test, and oftentimes it's pretty funny when people fail at it, but it's a good learning experience. So that ongoing touch points with employees and how a third party can do that, I think that's really important. And one of the things that I didn't mention up front, but it's the question process. The reason we want to do this, and what North Pier does for plan sponsors, is really try and document this. And David Hall mentioned that as well. Is documenting this is really critical. And an RFP process or an RFI process is a great first step in documenting what a service provider or a consultant or OCIO really can do for an organization, and it keeps them on the hook through the contractual process. And we think that's a critical part of the value we bring to clients. We think that's something that clients should really consider in what they're doing.
Yeah, I would just add on that most plan sponsors have a cadence in their quarterly meetings of things that they look at very specifically during that period. And I would suggest adding a cybersecurity checklist to your to one of the meetings in your during the quarter, and make sure, again, like Freeman says, that's documented annually.
Great, thank you. Let's switch gears to sort of answers that aren't so good. And again, the process that North Pier follows when managing RFPs for clients is to make sure that we not only ask the right questions, but that we go through a rigorous process to evaluate the answers. And so we get good answers, and we also get some poor answers as well, which is unfortunate, but as a reality of the situation. And these are pretty intuitive. A poor answer is going to look like something that is very vague, as Greg mentioned, not really thoroughly described, a short little blurb that says it's embedded in operating procedures. That's not a great answer. We've talked a lot about external expertise. We believe, and we encourage clients to evaluate this, is that external expertise in this area is important. And whether it's hiring a third party to help develop policies, whether it's a third party that does some intrusion testing, or it's through a comprehensive audit process that includes cybersecurity evaluation, we think that's really important. I mentioned before escalation. You want to see something that's really well described. So something that's poorly described or non-existent relative to escalation, both internally and with clients, that's obviously a red flag. Oftentimes, not often, sometimes we have response that cite privacy restrictions for not providing answers. And generally, that's not a great answer, but there are instances where privacy may be important relative to like insurance programs. And Greg, maybe that's a kickoff to give you some answers of some poor answers that you've received and why.
Yeah, thank you. I sometimes have fun with poor answers. So here's one. Big bank recognizes the importance of effective risk management, particularly within the areas of information security. Our firm conducts an annual independent assessment of and then there's a bunch of acronyms. Our firm is regulated by numerous authorities in all jurisdictions in which we operate, and sort of ... So trust us.
Yeah,
is really what you hear. Another one that we hear is here's one. The ability to help clients like your client achieve financial goals is possible when we also guard your personal and financial information. In order to prevent your firm from experiencing cybersecurity data breaches, we employ defenses throughout our security solutions. Specific details regarding these are confidential and not for distribution. So there are good reasons and good things to maintain confidential. This is not one of them. I read this and I say they don't have anything, that they do not have a cybersecurity protocol that they're proud of and that you would have. Now, there is an area that we see a lot with regard to cybersecurity insurance, where an organization says we have it in place, but we will not give you the amount because cyber criminals look at that, and organizations that have high amounts of cybersecurity insurance might be a target. That might be reasonable.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. So I think it's important. We mentioned about using third parties, and we're an advocate of that. But trying to get expertise to evaluate this is always very challenging, and documenting it is very important. So with the process that you go, and again, when a plan sponsor or investment organization hires us to do an evaluation of their current provider or do a search for them or a request for information, our view is that we want to get as much information documented. We want to ask as many of the right questions as we possibly can. We want to deliver much value to our clients about where there may be potential holes, and hopefully, the examples we gave you of sort of good answers versus bad answers can give you an idea of the types of things that are important to look for. I think that sort of concludes my section of it. We wanted to leave a little time at the end here for Q&A from the audience. Again, this is something that it's a very complex topic, and people have a lot of different questions. So I was hoping that there'd be some questions from the audience about what we described today.
Yeah, so we have a couple questions here. The first is, when running an RFP, how often do you see poor answers versus good answers?
Greg, I'll let you take that. I'll let you take that one, Greg.
Yeah, well, I'll say that it's not often that we see them, and organizations that don't have good cybersecurity protocols go in a penalty box or don't get invited back. We don't think it's appropriate for our clients to spend money evaluating a company we already know is might not be a prudent hire.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. Is our experience is probably a little different from maybe a plan sponsor or organization who does it themselves, because we spend a lot of time doing reviews and assessments, RFPs, day in and day out throughout the year. We get a pretty good idea who's of organizations that are good versus not so good. So we've already sort of pre-filtered the responses that we're getting. But even so, with them, we as Greg showed you an example, we'll get the answer occasionally that just really doesn't cut it.
And often organizations are better than their answer, and we know that. And so it's not just a written answer. It's worth following up with interviews on both good and bad answers.
I would just add, I know we're talking about retirement plans, but one of the things that HBL does often for plan sponsors is help with RFPs for health and welfare plans, right? Who's going to be your third-party administrator if you're a self-insured client, for example. And there are new laws on the books that plan service providers are not abiding by. And we advocate for those clients, and we say, look, let's remind you here, guys, this is the age of transparency, right? My personal opinion is that a plan sponsor who isn't getting straight answers from a potential service provider, that service provider doesn't deserve their business. There are people out there that we, and I mean we as an ecosystem, can help identify for you. And that's why I think it's so important to use, somebody like North Pier to work with HBL to make sure that you understand what is required and what is not required in terms of transparency. And I think that just as the way of the retirement plans in terms of fiduciary duty is the way that things are moving on the health and welfare side, I have a feeling that the health and welfare transparency rules are going to move just the same toward retirement plans. So don't be afraid to go with somebody who's fully transparent, would be my comment.
Thank you. We also have a question, if there are some additional online security tips for participants. And David, I know that you mentioned the resource that is going to be linked in the webinar. And what I'm going to do for everyone who's in attendance is I'm going to put that link in the chat for now, so you can explore that further. And then, as David mentioned, we are going to be following up with the slides. So this link will be also included in there. But for now, that link has been provided. So thank you for that question. Let's see, we have another question here. So this one, it looks like, I believe is from an advisor. Are there organizations I can outsource my cybersecurity to?
Yes, I mean, there are a number of them, and it depends on what aspect you want it, everything from from the intrusion testing all the way back to policy development. And Greg, maybe you have some examples of names, or David.
I could go through. I mean, if you want to contact me afterward, I can go through and see what I've seen in responses, who's using organizations that they're happy with. That's actually a good thing if you're in an advisor association, to really talk to other advisors about what they're using. There are also providers not only for things like so we have outside consultants that we use, and we also have software that requires us to take the I'll just call it the idiot test about every 3 weeks. And if I don't pass the would you click on this or click on that, my passwords get frozen. And while those might be really annoying to have, and there's certainly a lot of other things that are involved in this software. It's I'm glad that it's I'm glad that it's there and it's instituted for our firm.
And two, I would say there's great opportunity here for I won't call it peer review, but there are organizations out there like the like ASPA, like the local benefits councils that are associated with ASPA, like your in my case, the Southeast Benefits Education Network, where people like you are gathering and having conversations about the experiences they're having, vendors good and bad, right? And so in short, the answer to the question is yes, there are people that you can outsource this to, very much you would, like in the way that you would outsource some of your fiduciary duty with a plan to an advisor as a 321, right? But there are opportunities to have these conversations and really critically do a real litmus test with people who've already used these outsourced providers. And so I would say look to some of those organizations. It doesn't cost much to join, especially as a plan sponsor, and you're going to have access to lots of resources to do reviews of potential service provider hires.
Great.
And it looks like we have one last question here. David, I think this one will be for you. You mentioned that the DOL guidance may potentially be codified. Do you have any further information about when or if this will happen?
In short, no. I mean, we don't have a crystal ball, but what I will say, let me go back to my notes here. I know our managing partner sat down in an interview with a gentleman by the name of Preston Rutledge. He's formerly of the DOL, a DOL official. And all we know is that he was indicating that upon this guidance coming out, this is a top priority, a top initiative for EBSA. So, modifying ERISA to codify this and make it part of ERISA, or adding this to actual DOL regulations, again, no crystal ball. But what I will say is the DOL and EBSA are looking out for plan participants. And at the very highest level, if you're not on your toes related to cybersecurity, there is a serious risk that you're going to have a breach, and that there are other avenues by which you're going to be hurt, in your pocketbook as a business. And if you're not looking out for your plan participants, and if you're not mindful and aware of cybersecurity guidance, then that probably shows a lack of care in other areas, and that's going to be uncovered as well.
Right.
They dig deep. Let's put it that way.
Great. Okay. We just received one more question. Is there a set it and forget it serve we can outsource this I imagine that's service we can outsource this to yet, or is it still piecemeal putting together teams of assistants?
Greg, want to start with
Yeah,
that?
So I don't know if the question is about, is there one organization that you can outsource your entire cybersecurity, or are there organizations that that can help you with the evaluation? Certainly, there are organizations that can help you with the evaluation as a plan sponsor or an asset owner. And I am sure that there are organizations that can help advisors and investment managers to implement or to select organizations that can help them to implement. I'm not I don't work in the IT field, so I couldn't comment further.
Well, I think that, well, one of the things that you got to be careful about is the concept of set it and forget it. Is that this is a very rapidly evolving area, and so I think that due diligence, it's just hiring somebody that's good now and letting them do it. It's the organization staying on top of it and constantly evaluating whether they have the right resources, whether they've hired the right people, whether they've done all those aspects. There are many organizations, some of the large auditing organizations that have very large teams to help with this. But my personal view is that it will continue to evolve in a way that if you're not focused on it from the organizational level, you may miss some things going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's spot on. Particularly, David mentioned the software that we have on our computers for virus software is updated all the time. That these organizations that are working with you on your cybersecurity are studying all the time the new ways that cybersecurity is breached, and helping you to patch those both systematically and using software.